Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Breaking the Spell. So we have a special episode for you today because we have a returning guest, and that's Alex Pavlotski. So it's a good friend of mine all the way from Melbourne, Australia. And we did a previous session with him where we talked a lot about masculinity, trauma, anthropology. So in this case, right, with this episode, we actually try to do a special favor for him, which is he's going to talk about his upcoming course, which is about the Anthropology of Trauma. But if you haven't tuned into the previous episode, let me just give you a quick introduction to Alex. So Alex is an anthropologist and comic artist from Melbourne, Australia. His fieldwork was done with comic artists in Japan, and he's since then worked to integrate scientific analysis, ethnography, and the medium comics. His research interests are in comics, visual anthropology, theories of play, movement subcultures, neuroanthropology, masculinities, intercultural communication, and reactionary identities. So he's also, just a fun fact, he's also the creator of Parkour Panels, and that's a satirical comic where he discusses relevant issues in the parkour community. And we kind of touched a little bit on that with our previous episode with him. And that's quite a long conversation that we had. We appreciate so much that he spent the time with us, and we're glad to have him back on. So let's get going. So Alex, why not you just give us a little bit of a, maybe concise introduction, what we can expect from this course. So it's called the Anthropology of Trauma, and obviously trauma is quite a buzzword right now, and we'll try to get into that. But let us know, what can participants expect, if they want to sign up for your course.
Sure thing. Thank you. And right off the bat, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you guys and to promote. It's just a lot of fun to be back as well, and touching base with a lot of things, because I reviewed the previous episode before I came through. And I'm like, oh man, the trauma theme was really embedded in the previous conversation we had. It was just right there. And I was already kind of excited about it. And like a series of events pushes you in a direction. As this is being recorded visually, just a shout out, I'm dying of heat over here. I'm in a sauna. This room is super hot, so I'll be sweating all the way through, but it's great. I'll lose weight and you guys can be all disgusted about it. Apologies about that. It's just the most private room in the house and it doesn't have air conditioning. So since the last time we spoke, I have been really thinking about ways in which a lot of the themes of my previous bunch of years of research could be connected. And for anybody who hasn't watched the previous one, a lot of the work that I've done before was about mind-body connectivity, before then visual expression, but doesn't connect too directly, and then moving into neuroanthropology and then understanding radicalization, embodiment, all kinds of experiences that relate to that. So I've been sitting around sort of for the last bunch of years thinking about the way that these things connect, because it feels like you can't really pull on one of those components without unraveling a whole ball of string. And the concept of trauma is a particularly interesting one to me, because the more you think about it, the more it sort of falls into the mainstream, the more ambiguous, generalized, watered down it becomes, while simultaneously becoming more accepted and less stigmatized. So there's this weird exchange that happens whenever a concept as big as trauma comes into the mainstream. And then I started going, well, what was that all about? Looking into the clinical literature, looking into accreditation, conceptions of trauma-informed care. And one of the things that really quickly crystallized is that this idea is important and people understand that it's important, but it's still very nascent, still in the process of being translated from the academic world, and just presents very little agreement about the things that it entails, the way that it sort of represents and is encountered, and also what it means for broader society. So the more the ambiguity of this trauma idea hit me, the more I'm like, well, what do we know within the field of anthropology? And of course, like any good nerd, I hit the literature and discovered that anthropology hates the conception. It's historically really allergic to it. And I'm like, why? And one of the things that came up really quickly is the second that you start to pull on that thread, the idea of trauma is connected to conceptions of pathology, the conceptions of being broken, all of this historical stigma that's embedded within the history. And cross-culturally, people experience a lot of what we would consider to be traumatic within the Western world, but those highly stigmatizing sort of ideas aren't necessarily connected to it. So what somebody might consider to be traumatic in the Western world, an anthropologist might see outside of that context within a different environment and then go, well, that's part of a rite of passage. That's a transformative experience. What is trauma? We use that and it pathologizes. Can't use it. Everybody becomes shy of the label. Does all of that make sense so far?
Yep, absolutely. Totally.
And please feel free to jump in, like I said, at any point with questions or statements. But that was sort of the big impetus behind starting to think about the idea. And then, as I was saying before in our pre-conversations, the war in Ukraine happened. And that really pushed trauma into the forefront because what you have is an active war front. And a lot of the conversations that we previously had were connected to things like compound trauma, experiences that we had during lockdowns, things that have to do with people's loss of sense of comfort, loss of sense of routine. And then all of a sudden you have this real life theater of war in which you see the more classical sort of shell shock, the classic conceptions of trauma becoming really, really apparent. And it was interesting to me to see the way that people deal with that same idea. It's still trauma, regardless of whether or not we're talking about COVID lockdowns or some kind of experience that breaks somebody's conceptual mold, and the stuff that you experience as a result of direct sort of concussive, intense war field sort of experience. So yeah, that really consolidated. I went, look, I'm going to sit down. I feel highly self-conscious because I don't have the clinical training to sit down and go through a lot of what would be the nitty-gritty of the clinical practice. But anthropology and cognitive anthropology, particularly in neuroscience, has got so much to say about it. So I pulled the course together. That's talk about long-winded. That was just me doing the introduction as to why the course sort of came around and what a lot of the logics were. So summary-wise, I want to define trauma in a way that is functional and recognizable, from the clinical to the way that it's applied within the sort of the outside of war everyday context. Then I want to look at it cross-culturally, dissect it historically and the way that it's applied. I want to look down at the utility of it and the reality of its like sort of cross-cultural human experience, but also the way that actually societies, including our own, globally actually utilize it as a rite of passage on a regular basis. So there's a utility to the concept of trauma. That's something that I'm really excited about talking about as a general ecology. And then going through to the idea of self-recognition and recognition of others. That's the 3-second summary. But I can go through it more slowly if that's what we want. I'll pause for a second to see if anybody's got any questions or points or anything that can be pulled.
Yeah, I think I have a few immediate responses. One, I am really interested to explore further how you define trauma functionally. You say it's become so diffuse and ambiguous that it's almost lost its usefulness as a term. And I haven't for myself come up with, I don't know, a definition of trauma that I'm happy with. And I don't often talk to people. So it would be great to get your views on it.
Yeah.
Secondly, yeah, you just mentioned trauma as a useful rite of passage, and I'd be interested in exploring that further. Recently, I've been listening to some really interesting talks by people like Komolafe, Sophie Strand, Tyson Yunkaporta. I don't know if you're familiar with any of them, but you know, they often talk about things from an indigenous perspective. And yeah, I remember like Komolafe during this one webinar, he said, you know, I'm not gonna like tiptoe around this idea of trauma, which he thinks is a very Western concept. And he, you know, he just went ahead and said things that like might be quite triggering. And these days, like people are just really worried about triggering people. And he just kind of said, you know, I think it's time to get past that. So yeah, I'm interested in positive reframings of trauma. So yeah, those are my two reactions right now.
Yeah, happy to respond to that. That's great. I'm actually the response to the first questions flows on brilliantly in terms of the others. So it's a good way to frame it. And I'm happy that the first thing that you asked is functioning definition. Because to me, it's really, really important that this subject isn't approached from either the stigmatizing or romanticizing perspective. So I can't help it. It's the cognitive anthropologist in me. It's the clinical stuff, but I always aim for an objective, which is both an interesting thing to want to achieve with this topic, but also is ultimately impossible, because one of the things that I've learned while I was reading and studying and interacting with people while I was building this course is quite often the cure, the way that you reach a traumatic event, is completely unconventional. So anti-logical by definition of nature, which is just this really fun paradox to play with. So when I was thinking about the way that I wanted to frame my definition, functionally, I wanted to create one that is neutral, but also one that fits into the way that the concept of trauma is used across the spectrum of application, from people who are traumatized in the most severe chronic sense, as in immobile, dissociative, all of these really powerful psychiatric, psychological, neurological sort of symptomatics, to people who are defining their first moment of adolescent understanding of something as traumatic and are losing their childhood and are mourning that. Like, the spectrum ranges all the way through there. And the best thing that I can do is to say it is a process of learning that is involuntarily imposed and is contrary to prior or existing understandings. And that is, I know, a very boring and clinical definition, but the reason why it has to be that way is the neutrality of it allows you to unpack the harmonica of the way that traumatic events are manifest across society. And then you start to see it as process of learning, sometimes completely undirected, sometimes intentionally set up and directed, always within a social context and orchestrated and understood more broadly than that individual experience. So for that reason, that's the definition that I want to work with. And in a way, that's kind of controversial, because I actually presented a paper about this about 4 years ago now, and it split the room amongst fellow academics, anthropology, practitioners, professors, and lecturers. Half the people loved the idea of examining trauma in this sort of objective sense in a cross-cultural way. The other half really struggled with it because it is a sacred word for people who have experienced something that is difficult to scale, that is difficult to objectivize. So yeah, that's something that I'm quite conscious of. So that's answering the first question.
Sorry, could you actually repeat that definition more slowly? Because I think I may have missed the second half of that.
Yeah. So it is trauma is a process of learning, or a mechanism even of learning, specifically related to things that you cannot control and contextualize within a particular framework or ecological sort of process of understanding, which, yeah, a lot of clinicians and trauma destigmatization people would get really upset at me right now, because it makes it sound almost unbindingly, unclinically pathological. But that's sort of the idea, because it can include that pathological scale. So does that make sense? 3 components. It's the process of learning, has to be outside of the control of the person immediately involved, and has that sort of ultimate redeeming, ultimate transforming sort of quality to it, which is a lot of fun to talk about.
Can I just ask, right, for the other half, as you mentioned, in the room, who were objectified, object to your definition, is it because there is obviously a certain, I don't want to say agenda, because it's not obviously coordinated, it's not clandestine, but there is a sort of onus, right, to try to capture the normative value of trauma, that is something that is negative, that is something we're trying to maybe eradicate, that we are, that there are trauma specialists out there who are trying to move us towards a trauma-free world. Is that perhaps the reason for, that opposition?
I think, yes, but in a very roundabout way. I think a much more deliberate and like surface reason for the rejection of it is the objectification, the attempt to try to put measurement upon the concept of trauma. One is clinically really hard to do, so it hasn't been done all that much, not without dispute. To take things in a very trashy direction for a second, if anybody was watching the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, from a clinical perspective, from the perspective of somebody who's really interested in trauma, one of the most interesting bits about it was that they had two psychologists come out and read the same diagnostic and deliver the same tests and come out with really different results. So even what you consider to be the gold standard in the measurement of the impact of trauma or the severity of trauma is really, really difficult because a lot of it is subjectively reported. You can stray into category where you're talking about neurological typification. So when you see dissociation, dilated eyes, all the usual sort of physiological symptoms that then can be connected to a neurological condition, that's a whole other thing. And we barely ever use that when we talk about trauma. That's highly clinical. But the current methods are really, really inaccurate. So that's a big issue because within, let's say, anthropology, if you're going out and you're studying the victims of, this is an actual case study, and I apologize if the person is out. I don't think that they will be. It's been so long, and I'll keep it ambiguous. But there was a case study in which somebody was studying, as a cohort, a group of people who were heavily disadvantaged by a loss of privilege. It was in South Africa, and these were the people who had benefited from apartheid. Apartheid fell apart. The horrible stories begin. And they had a really powerful narrative of trauma. Trauma was key to their narrative. They had highly wealthy people who'd migrated out of apartheid, where they benefited with tremendous fortunes into Australia, America, Canada, etc. And you have a conversation about what defines trauma. And it would be very difficult to write a sympathetic ethnography or portrayal without giving the full benefit of the doubt to the self-diagnosed conception of trauma that these people were talking about the stereotypes, the racism, the loss of privilege. And if we were to look at it objectively, those people's conceptions of trauma would be immediately scaled down, especially in relation to the people who suffered as a result of their tremendous privilege. And that is not a conversation that most people are comfortable having, because if we were to get elitist about the conception of trauma, which is the way that it's framed as elitist in these discussions, then people who have had childhood experiences of car accidents within suburban environments with no major injury would be triaged underneath people who have experienced war zone conflict, poverty, hunger, etc. I don't know whether or not that's the case where you guys are from, but that's not the client base of the psychological or psychiatric establishment for a lot of the developed world, if we put it in that particular way. So it demonstrates that the system is quite flipped on its head. And it's the second that you say trauma is gradiated towards the people who are suffering most, you lose the clientele for trauma, and you no longer have hilarious clickbaity articles about your levels of trauma because, you had to let go of the idea of Santa Claus. Probably a bit too on the nose considering the time of year, but one of those kinds of frivolous examples. Yeah, I'm hoping that makes sense. Is there any questions or anything else I can check in there?
Okay, so yeah, going back to your definition, I think I pretty much understand the idea behind learning. I understand under conditions that are sort of not under the person's control, that has been imposed from outside. And then the third factor was that it has a redeeming or transformative quality. Is that what you said?
It's deeply embedded within the social and cognitive cultural context within which this trauma occurs. Redeeming probably isn't the right word. Redeeming was the word that I had because we were talking about the idea of keeping trauma neutral. Transformative would be the broadly more direct and applicable idea here. So it's interesting to see one of the things that really becomes apparent when you look at the cross-cultural experiences of what would be objectively traumatic experiences. There's many cultural systems that consider trauma to be stock standard as an element of the emotional landscape, the experiential landscape of human life. And so very wisely, and as adaptive systems should, they've come up with solutions for it through conceptions of ritual, through conception of storytelling, most importantly through the conception of public recognition of this process of transformation. We don't have, there's a lot of places that no longer have a lot of that stuff in place. And that tends to go hand in hand with trauma as being deeply stigmatized and rejected. I feel like I've gone off topic. Am I answering the question? Crap, I've lost myself in a train of thought.
Yeah, no, you're good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you're trying to unpack what transformative means, I guess.
So that element in terms of the course and the way that I want to engage with it is to analyze the way that the trauma is perceived, not just by the person, but the person within their ecology. And one of the things that immediately comes up is that if the ecology is geared towards accepting the transformation that has wrought upon the person who's experienced it. So if the trauma has occurred to somebody, they've been irrevocably transformed. And that's just the reality. That's what makes it a learning process. You can't go back. It's been imposed upon you. You simply cannot get away from it. If you have a social system that then says, we understand the nature of your transformation, we now see you as the new person who comes out of the other end, and we honor, respect, or at the very least recognize who it is this person is once they've exited that phase. What we would consider to be a lot of the negative symptomology of trauma disappears, and it no longer becomes trauma, it becomes something incredibly powerful. And it's fascinating watching the system within which, like the Western medical system, I guess would be the best way to describe it, struggle with this conception of transformation and not be able to engage while treating people who are radically transformed by some kind of experience that they've had. So yeah, that is something that I want to unpack. And it's one of the things that I think makes this topic so interesting, and potentially one of the things that makes it so an interesting angle to explore trauma from, because it is a neutral way to look at it, the utility and the debilitating sort of impact of all of that process. Geez, I talk a lot.
Yeah, so I think we should just mention this as well, is that your course, right, it actually comes with 3 weeks of classes. So just to mention, pragmatically speaking, this is what, a participant should expect. And, you do cover this topic about transformation and the self in week 2, from what I'm seeing from your outline. But there's very curious wording you use here. So I'm reading it, that you're going to talk about trauma and the unalienable self. Yeah. So I'm very curious if you can expand a little bit on that. What do you mean by unalienable?
The idea of on top of everything, I've got allergies, so pardon me. But the idea of the unalienable self is the conception of a self that can't be left behind. That the second that you leave it behind, you're left without, and you are somehow transformed or forever lacking. The reason why I think this is an important thing to unpack, and actually I think you'd probably find it familiar, Doug, because you've heard a little bit of this stuff in the anthropology courses that we've done together, is because it's deeply connected within a particular cultural tradition that has its roots, Christianity, and then before that, the Platonic sort of Western mystics, this whole idea of the soul and the individualized self. And wonderful poetic metaphor, incredibly useful in all kinds of ways, underpins so many conceptions of anywhere that has a very heavily Christian sort of outlook upon the world, including what is the baseline and the methodology for clinical treatments of trauma. So unpacking that story, I'll unpack it super briefly. If it doesn't make any sense, ask me questions or let me know whether or not it's not relevant or interesting, but I think that it's important. We begin with a particular tradition amongst a certain group of mystic cults founded in the Middle East that believes, unlike many other traditions, that there is a singular essence that defines you throughout your lifetime that is true and pure, and the progression of your life cycle takes you away from the purest, most innocent version of yourself towards what is ultimately corruption, death, and decay, potentially heaven, Christian mythology. We all hear all that kind of stuff. Incredible amounts of understanding of medicine and cognition within anywhere that's affected by that region has I wouldn't even call it, like, it's funny because you'd call this a sublimated notion or like an inherent bias, but it's not inherent or sublimated in any way. It is methodologically stated over and over again that there's this conception of a singular self and a continuity of self, this notion of consciousness that is continuous and you've always had it since you were, and characteristics and traits that you had from the beginning should be continued. And wonderful as a metaphor until you encounter rapture, until you encounter a moment which is truly out of your capacity to process or capacity to control, that shatters previous conceptions of understandings, especially simplistic ones like good or bad. Why do bad things happen to good people is the first moment of critique for that kind of system. And we look at it, and it's easy for us to be able to see it and critique it, but it's also one of the underlying base conceptions of a lot of treatment methodology for people who are experiencing trauma, particularly talking about recovery in a therapeutic sort of clinical setting. And that, to me, is a tremendous crime and horrible methodology, because there is no greater, and I'm going to swear, there's no greater headfuck in the world than coming out of an undeniably transformative experience, and then as your goal to recovery, trying to return to a sense of self that existed, or a conception or a version of yourself that existed before that transformative experience occurred. It's putting the genie in the bottle. It's trying to unbreak boundaries. It's just incredibly difficult, and it's one of the most reportedly common points of tension for anybody who's going through recovery from a traumatic experience. And yeah, it's, why does that happen? It doesn't make sense. There's so many fantastic examples of societally built systems that allow us rites of passage, as I have talked about many times, intentionally set up traumatic experiences with outcomes that have a recognition and an ecology of understanding about that transformation. Meantime, we've got people who have gone through something, seeing somebody pass away or going through something deeply traumatic, that true sense of that impactful trauma, they know they no longer have a perception of the world, and they can never return to a perception of the world that they used to hold. But over and over again, overtly and in subverted ways, they're being told, you need to get back to your purest sense of self. So yeah, that's the unalienable self, is that conception, that unpervertible, unique sense of you. It's the soul, basically, the Christian conception of the soul, and how it really imposes itself on our understanding of traumatic experience. That's what that's actually about.
Yeah, no, I'm wondering, I want to keep engaging with this definition of trauma, and I don't know if you'd be open with just exploring, like,
absolutely,
I could throw out some, typical ways that I've heard people talk about trauma, and then see how you map it onto your definition, or to show what's different. So, for instance, just off the top of my head, if I think of trauma, I'm thinking, some things happen to a person, and as a result, they've been conditioned. That's where the learning comes in. In order to survive it, to survive this thing that is overwhelming their system, right? So that's kind of like the uncontrollable aspect. It's, because if you could control it, you would not have this thing that is totally overwhelming. So it's overwhelming. In order to survive it, they've had to learn certain conditioning. And then I think this is where I've heard people talk about it in a contemporary setting, that whatever your conditioning is, it is ill-adapted to your current circumstances. So it may have been appropriate at the time when the trauma happened, but you've now moved on. Your life circumstances are different. But you're still reacting with maybe like the fear response or the freeze response. And so the process of overcoming that trauma is about unlearning or trying to learn that, okay, situations have changed and I can now respond differently. So that's one sort of concept of trauma that I've heard. And how do you map it onto your definition?
Absolutely. I agree with that definition 100%, would be the simple way to state it. And I think that that definition completely validates the one that I gave you, because it's specifically talking about recovery as a relearning process, as a rehabilitation in the physical sense, as in learning to walk again. Excuse my ongoing cough. So yeah, the concept of coming through a traumatic experience and then having to pick it up all over again is the basis of things like exposure therapy. And I've been looking deeply into therapeutic and clinical processes but all of them include an element of that. And a lot of the more gentle methodologies have to do with grounding the person so that they don't leave, because in the most extreme sort of variations of trauma, people literally they time travel back to the traumatic event, so you can't get them back. Yeah, 100%. I agree with that definition. I think mine includes and encompasses it. The reason why mine can do that is because it's vague, because I also want to include cross-cultural examples.
Yeah, maybe I can go into that actually, because, the other part of your course, the anthropology part, is really about the cross-cultural differences. And, actually you started our conversation with this point about how something that we may define as trauma in the West may not be defined the same way in another culture. And I'm just, thinking of this off the top of my head. There's a very recent book that's out by one of the experts on trauma, which is Gabor Mate, right? And he wrote a book called The Myth of Normal, just came out, so I haven't read it yet, but I know it's out. I've read a few interviews. And one of the things that he actually does agree with when it comes to defining trauma in contemporary modern society. So he's obviously talking about America or UK, maybe even places like Singapore, Japan, where, we are living in the system of, hyper competitive capitalism. And he actually considers that we all are embedded in this complex of obviously capitalist dynamics, and that actually does lead to some form of trauma. So I'm just wondering, what do you make of such statements and analysis, because maybe another person could say, well, this is the system we live in. It shouldn't be pathologized that way. You finding a job, you not be able to find a job, you trying to struggle, making a livelihood should not be construed as a form of trauma. So I'm just wondering what you make of perhaps some of these reactionary responses, to the definition of trauma.
I really, really like Gabor Mate's work. I think he lays it down so foundationally. The concept of trauma is laid down so foundationally across it that I hesitate to 100% get behind it, because I feel like I need to read everything that he said. But everything that I've seen, yeah, I agree with tremendously. The second part of the question is slipped out, because now I was just thinking about the books that I remember reading by that guy. What was the second bit of the question? Sorry, Dan.
Well, like I said, there is a political dimension to how people define trauma, right? Like I said, maybe just to make it very simply, someone who defends, say, capitalism would probably, viciously argue against Gabor Mate's contention that living under capitalism is a form of trauma.
Absolutely, they would. I would say that is an exceptionally cynical perspective from anybody who would make it from that position, because, and it's part of the thing that I wanted to get into in my course, is there's a utility to trauma, and the state, all states, through militaries, through police forces, through firefighters, people who, by the nature of their essential duties, are exposed to traumatic events, are really well skilled at utilizing trauma and dealing with trauma within those particular environments. So to say that pathologizing things like Gabor Mate's is classic examples, and apologies for my accent and my bad pronunciation of his name, but is the Spock method of child rearing. He contends that the idea of ignoring a child as it cries is a compound trauma experience, and he's neurobiologically, as far as I know, with my qualifications, I don't dispute that at all. There's no reason why a traumatic circuit, a traumatic pathway, or an element of wiring wouldn't be formed in the precognitive stage, so in the infancy stage. So scientifically, I agree, but anybody who would make a critique on the basis of, oh, toughen up and it's not a real thing, and the dismissal of the process of learning, the traumatic learning within our upbringings, well, all you have to do is look at what the police, the military, the fire force, all of these people do. I mean, we harness trauma all the time. And we collectively, within every single government system, play into it. We celebrate the heroes on the front line, the people who are exposed to the most traumatic events. We celebrate doctors. We celebrate all these people. And we kind of do it because we understand that if we didn't, they would be traumatized beyond all belief. And that's such a fascinating case study, because you think about it, we are collectively participating in an exercise of trauma relief for people who are in some of the most traumatic situations within society by celebrating these people within these professions. The idea of celebrating a group of people itself is an incredible prophylactic for what we would consider to be debilitating trauma. And just following this thread for a second, for anybody who hasn't seen the fantastic documentary, The Act of Killing, have you guys seen The Act of Killing?
Yeah, I have. Amazing.
Oh, yeah. So check it out if you haven't seen it. Yeah, it's the entire story of that documentary is pursuing this idea of people who have done things that would traumatize you, who exist within a context of justification, versus people who have done things that would traumatize you that exist with a thin veil of justification, and how easily that can be torn away. That should be ambiguous enough that it's not a spoiler to anybody, but to anybody who's seen the movie, that's exactly the contrast between two of the characters who are involved. Final breakdown, all that kind of stuff is related to this. Some people are held up and protected from the negative impacts of trauma through the societal context, through the accolades that they receive. In fact, we all kind of get it. And so we provide the accolades to make sure that these people aren't too traumatized and they continue doing the difficult jobs that we probably couldn't handle.
Yeah, I mean, just for Douglas's benefit, because maybe sounds like you didn't watch the movie. It's about these killers in Indonesia during the sort of campaign against so-called communists, but it was actually like they were like killing like a lot of like ethnic Chinese, and yeah, but these killers, like, yeah, they're still they haven't been called to justice. In fact, in some of their towns, they're hailed as heroes. They go on talk shows, they talk openly about the things they did. Yeah, but they were essentially kind of like, gangsters and death squads. That's the one you're referring to, right, Alex?
Yeah, that's right. I thought, though, I think it was Cambodia. I might be wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Indonesia.
I'll have to double check. Yeah.
Yeah. But what was interesting is at the end of the movie, there was this enigmatic shot of like a fast food restaurant. And it was only in an interview that the director explained why that was there. And he was trying to suggest that just as these killers justified what they did, and they told themselves lies in order to live with what they had done, so all of us in a capitalist society tell ourselves lies to get by with our lives, because, yeah, like we're all kind of killers in a way, like just by our lifestyles. We're responsible for a lot of, like, I don't know, just suffering. And so, yeah, no, I thought that was, pretty relevant to Douglas's question about capitalism.
Yeah, and you're right, Ongsu, it's Indonesia. Just look it up.
It's Indonesia, thank you.
Yeah. So maybe, let me just ask you also, since we did talk about it a little bit, about healing and the transformative power of trauma. So actually by your the last class of the week, which is week 3, you actually do put the theme out there towards healing and support. And one part of it, of your class, the components, is to identify trauma. So I just want to ask you a sensitive question. Obviously, I don't think you intend for your course to be therapeutic. So someone who's trying to work on themselves shouldn't come to your class thinking that they can find an answer. But nevertheless, you're going to try to give support. So perhaps you can just suggest what kind of mindset should a person coming into your class who is curious about trauma, who may be working on his or own trauma, what they should take away in terms of like a direction towards healing and finding support.
Yeah. So the best way to approach that kind of conversation is, in my opinion, to begin with the physiological underpinnings. And the idea is, and actually I thought about the structure of the course quite a bit, and initially I wanted to start with healing and homeostasis, because working with physiological mechanisms and feedback processes, which many disciplines are terrific at, is the sort of the foundation of that feedback loop that allows you to begin self-therapy. But then I went, hang on, no, that would make it seem like everybody here is expected to be traumatized. And I don't think that's the demographic. I think a lot of the people who are coming to this course are in a support position. I'm impressed by the enrollment so far. We've got 3 counselors with different levels of qualification. So I better be on the ball when it comes to this material. But I'm also really delighted. Like, it's such a compliment that they're interested in this perspective. So what I'm hoping to be able to do is to be able to sprinkle a lot of the pragmatic physiological understanding throughout the entire course, and then arriving at mechanisms of trauma. We get down, so this is the identifying mechanism and mechanisms. What we start doing is talking about the biological components that relate to regulating and generating trauma responses, really clinical sort of understanding, but then also connect that to a methodology that applies to self-calming, soothing, presenting, grounding, etc. practice, to then be able to turn around and say, okay, if you are dealing with somebody, how do you recognize somebody is entering a dissociative state, panic attack, or a defensive position? What can you do to protect yourself? So I really wanted this to be quite pragmatic. I wanted to seed a lot of the previous knowledge back into immediate context and talk about recognizing it. And this is me potentially walking a dangerous fine line, but I was hoping to be able to present this in a way and with sufficient forewarning that would allow people to treat this as something they can recognize in themselves and in others. So the essence of it is the various mechanical biocognitive mechanisms that are present within the triggering of a trauma response, and also within the way that people think within these trauma states, are actually universally present. We all can sort of experiment by pushing the button on the instrument that is our mind and generate a response so that we can recognize it in others and then be able to control it. So by the time that we're at that week, I'm hoping that as I speak about the mechanisms, as I speak about things like the hormonal cascades and how they're activated and how they correspond with physiological states, I'm hoping that people will know whether or not they're speaking about themselves or the others that are in their care. The other thing about it is I'm hoping to really establish some groundwork for a healthy disrespect of stigmatizing diagnoses in week 2. So one of the things that I'm hoping to be able to do is talk about the reality of post-traumatic growth and recognizing the moments that provide people with the opportunity to engage it. So that's sort of that whole tail section. It sounds exceptionally vague, but that's because everything in week 3 is resting upon the previous 2 weeks. So it's very easy for me to be able to draw a thing together, but to be able to explain it without going in and going backwards throughout the others is a little bit hard.
Yeah, this might be going off on a tangent, but something that's coming up for me now is just, I mean, when you're talking about like healing and homeostasis, I've been reading a lot about Gaia theory, James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis.
Yeah,
I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's just the idea that the entire living planet is like a self-regulating organism almost, involving animate and inanimate elements, right? Like oceans, atmosphere, rocks, and living creatures are all sort of forming this complex web of relationships that keeps the planet in homeostasis. I mean, the reason why he came up with the hypothesis was because he observed that over billions of years, the planet was able to preserve, certain ratios of elements in the atmosphere, like oxygen, nitrogen, in these precise ratios. And that could only happen if the entire thing was like this living thing. And, so like more and more why I'm really interested in Gaia theories, because like I feel that collectively, I agree with James Lovelock, like as a human species, we have to understand our planet better in order to survive. And the Gaia theory is one of the best metaphors out there to inform us on how we should be adapting. Like we need to learn like how Gaia is regulating herself and what the planet's homeostasis requires, because if we act out of accordance with that, Gaia is pretty much going to kick us out. Like she's going to make us extinct because we're disrupting the balance. And I feel like more and more, like what's going to happen with climate change is it's going to feel like trauma. I think all of us are going to go through massive amounts of trauma. And so I actually think like it's important to pick up these skills or learn how we're going to approach trauma, because it's going to be a necessary part of our maturity as a species as we come back into alignment with Gaia. So that's what I'm thinking, and I'm curious what your response to that would be.
Well, absolutely. So Gaia theory, super exciting, wonderful metaphor. Interesting to see how often is applied within cultural systems that aren't necessarily, so we could just say capitalism for shorthand, but any cultural system that isn't status obsessed / materially obsessed. So capitalism, one of the many manifestations. Monarchy is another excellent example. It's really interesting to see that outside of those systems, there is a reach towards that homeostatic sympathy with the environment. And a lot of the sort of mysticism that comes out of what we consider to be indigenous hunting cultures isn't necessarily about, for example, killing animals, as it is about the way that everything becomes what we would in the scientific community call a biocultural marker for the health of the relationship between the human community and the ecology within it exists. We, with our advanced capitalism, with our various advanced economic systems, we have lost that homeostatic rhythm. We've lost the pulse of it in a really, really interesting way. And it's interesting because you'll hear people on the left and the right of the political spectrum sort of broadly agreeing on this idea. Doesn't go to say that we ourselves aren't reaching for a homeostasis, which is another way to look at it. If the ecology broadly, including ourselves, is looking for a homeostatic system, human beings as a being that's able to generate its own ecology is weirdly driving its own next evolutionary homeostasis, which is a weird, convoluted way of saying we transform the environment, but we appear to have this weird thing that we can do where we remove ourselves from our immediate natural ecology and cocoon ourselves within a digital, within an urban, within a completely artificial ecology. So there's a fantastic series of conversations to be had there. And a lot of the critiques of that system are justified and kind of read along the lines of a traumatic response, because we are so comfortable within that cocoon that stepping out of it to suddenly understand how dependent we are within this network, how tight an equilibrium true homeostasis, like in that Gaia theory sense, it really depends. For anybody who's done my course before, I call it a triangle tipping moment, the cognitive triangle of your thought gets knocked over. I think there's a concept called shattered assumption theory, where people get their mind blown and they have to reconfigure their worldview. Part of the interesting thing about that is trauma is different from other forms of learning because you don't get the opportunity to decide how and when it shows up. So when it comes to political reality, which isn't an imposed traumatic reality, people get really abstract about things like climate change. People get really abstract about the excesses of capitalism. People think that recycling is a fantastic idea when the reality is Coca-Cola invented the whole thing as a gimmick, and the number one cause of problems is the corporation, not the individual. Like all of these kinds of classic things that are just completely true are easier to simply push away when your concept of learning has that component of choice. When you get to go, well, I'd rather not believe that, or I don't think about it and I don't want to deal with it. And there's a truth when you speak to people who say, I don't watch the news because I find it depressing, or I get traumatized by the news even. That is something that gets thrown around a tiny bit. There's a truth to that statement. But the scale of the trauma is, on the seismic scale, very, very small. It's a toddler's footprint. And from the sort of growth perspective individually, it's quite essential, because the reality is resilience in terms of your cognitive framing is related to post-traumatic growth. You don't have to have everything be a revelation. You can gentle the impact, but you still need to have a series of realizations as you progress through life. And you need to break previous cognitive structures to be able to mature properly. So there's a real cognitive utility to trauma. Yeah, that's me ranting on that. I could go on, but I'm probably going to pull myself back a bit.
No, I think that's great. I think it's very nice that, you know, Ongsu managed to bring in what he's reading and Gaia theory, and how we're also able to relate, you know, the content of your course, trauma, to contemporary concerns, you know, with the environment, with capitalism. And, you know, you were just saying something about, you know, human beings have this ability to extract themselves from their natural ecology and to embed themselves in a much more artificial one. And I was just thinking, when you mentioned that, about how certain people talk about being traumatized from, say, cyberbullying, cyberstalking. So, you know, there are all sorts of insidious ways that trauma enters our system, right? And sometimes it's a wonder as to whether, when we design new systems, new environments to put ourselves into, have we given consideration to the kind of harms that could lead to, you know, different symptoms of trauma. So I was thinking maybe just a couple more questions. Then after that, you should kind of cap it with, you know, like a blurb as to, you know, what to expect from the course. So I want to ask one more question. You can respond to what I just said. Ongsu should ask one more question as well. So I was wondering, you know, you mentioned the counselors that are now participants in your course, right? And I'm also seeing within the political world, to some degree, you know, politicians are trying to show themselves to be much more progressive about mental health support. So they talk openly about depression, suicide. They encourage people to, you know, seek out mental health support services. So do you envision a world where trauma would also become that mainstream buzzword, and politicians or political discourse will be a lot more receptive to talking about trauma?
So it's interesting. I imagine a world where we can talk about trauma in a more nuanced way than we currently do, certainly. I think that we either underuse it or we overuse it. Currently, we don't know where we sit. There are people who are specialists who deal with the hard clinical variation, the extreme cases, who have gold medals, who can use that term in every way that they like. But trauma isn't just a therapeutic term. It's not just therapists that are expected to be able to deal with it now, because it's just overwhelmingly popular schema. But it's also popular culture. Like when we talk about trauma-informed, like, for example, I spent the last year in the private sector working in user experience design. And trauma-informed learning is one of those things that gets thrown around constantly. I've asked very specifically many people who are trainers who are throwing the term around, and there's no certainty about what it means. What is it? Oh, we have to be really careful about the way that traumatized people might present and be around us, and we have to be sensitive to them because they're a net benefit. I'm like, great, what does that mean? They're like, just, we have a paper that we read off. That's how it works. So yeah, I really want it to be used appropriately. I want it to be used in the sense of that uncontrollable and powerful experience that really throws your schema out of control, and it has to be externally exposed, and it has to have that social element to it. If we can use it in that way, boy, that'd be really exciting. And this connects back to what you were saying, because previously the first section of the question, and I haven't included this in this course, but I'm probably going to end up informally talking about it, because there's a good evidence base to suggest that we have a biological need for a traumatic experience. And I did stand up for a little while, quite a few years ago, before I went to the University of Auckland. And this was part of my stand-up bit, because I just couldn't, I thought it was very funny. And the basis of it is, you have this incredible potential. We live within this scientific utopia. And I'm speaking, of course, about my own city of Melbourne, because I was writing it in that city. We live in this environment where you can have food from anywhere in the world, made to the standard of your local ingredient, And if that's not sufficient, then we can get people to cook it who are from that part of the world. Like that's the level of authenticity that is available to us, and we're lit up and we're living in this utopian space. And yet we have these situations where we have to watch the Real Housewives of wherever the fuck the television reality series is, in which people like ourselves, but even more privileged, exist in a world where a sideways glance across a room is sufficient cause for a dramatic narrative, potential relationship breakdowns, all of this kind of stuff. And, you know, I look at that and you go, what is that? What is that? That yearning for drama. You just put them out in the middle of the savannah and make them chase the deer. And then you have that sense really deeply satisfied, because I assure you that nobody's going to give two flying fucks about sideways glances at the dinner table after that. All of that getting at the basic idea of we have an element of us that calls for trauma. And this is a really fun sort of place to go. The people who have been raised without it are almost as stunted by its absence as people who have had a surplus of it and are really having a difficult time, because those people end up looking internally and generating that conception of the Real Housewives as a show, because it's a whole bunch of people who have no physiological stakes left in the real world. Like they are not scared of anything. They are so protected, cloistered, and provided for that the notion of danger and threat is a limited vocabulary. So what happens is you end up amplifying the signal. Somebody's negative intention becomes all of that you need to be able to generate a panic state and all of these essential states for our processing. So yeah, what a weird situation to be in. Because on one hand, we want to stigmatize trauma, but on the other hand, look, if you don't have enough of it, people will instinctively search for that identity-defining experience. And my personal theory, I just let it slip, is that it has to do with the conception of identity formation. But that's really nascent. That's at least the way that I think about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I like that. Like perhaps there is some kind of instinctual drive people to seek challenge and to overcome barriers. So, you know, perhaps it's just couched in the language of trauma, but a kind of trauma that perhaps, you know, we just need to be comfortable with looking for, and we're comfortable putting ourselves into. Also, why not just ask one last question?
I don't have so much of a question, but just final sort of like thoughts that are coming together for me, or appreciation. I'm really appreciating, I think, in the course of this conversation, I think you've managed to really clarify how you're trying to approach trauma in ways that are neutral. So it's neither romanticizing it nor stigmatizing it. And I think, like, you know, one of the key phrases I think you used was like, we have to recognize different forms of learning, that there are forms of learning that we don't choose and that are imposed on us, and that we can value those. And it's making me think of like, one of the books that I've read this year that has really influenced me profoundly is a book called Hospicing Modernity. And it really, like, that book opened my eyes to how much our modern society makes us attached to certain things like control and ownership. And even with things like learning, like our motto of the University of a Learner is self-directed learning. Like we choose what we want to learn. And the book was basically talking about how a lot of learning may not even feel like learning. It could actually be very uncomfortable. And the same thing with healing. Like healing isn't always pleasant. It can be painful. It takes a long time. And until we learn to like embrace these forms of healing, like we're not going to actually do the work that we need to do. So I'm really appreciating your perspective on trauma in relation to this. And I'm also just remembering, even from our previous conversation, that I love how you combine your different interests. And I'm hoping in this course, I have no idea what it's going to be like, but I'm hoping that, I don't know, you have some comic illustrations and that you'll be able to bring in like your diverse interests. As you said, like it's this tangled knot that you can't really, separate, each of these things. So I think to anyone watching this, I think I would encourage them to check out your rich universe of interests.
Thank you. That's really appreciated. One thing that I want to say that is actually a really good point to sort of take off that's one of the things that's been most uplifting about researching the shit out of trauma for the last little while. The healing process for trauma, and I sort of hinted at this before, is the most anti-cognitively logical thing. And it's incredibly interesting to converse with and see the practice of really good trauma counseling in action, because it's not something that can be rationalized. And the other thing that I would add is I actually struggled a fair bit with writing this course as opposed to many of the others, because I share quite a bit of myself in my courses. But I went to a war zone and I came back and was immediately given a PTSD label. And there were components of that experience that I really wanted to bring in without hopefully being too navel gazing. But have that component of what it's like to be on the other side and to be able to transition over. And yeah, it's just a really, really exciting place to be able to turn around and say, wait, no, we can't logic your way out of this. Like I can sit down if I had a direct transfer method of getting my information into somebody else's brain who was going through a post-traumatic episode, I would be able to give them the absolute clinical, everything that I have about what trauma is, but it would do them absolutely no help, because knowing is actually a completely different part of your brain, like literally segmentedly, departmentally disconnected from the various visceral experiences that people go through when they have a trauma response. So yeah, there's something magical and interesting about I don't know, getting people to do the silliest shit to be able to get them back into a particular state, and seeing it really lays bare the ineffectiveness and absurdity of the myth that you can rationalize your way through any problem, that you can simply apply logic, and then the realization will set you free. Post-traumatic work is so much about feeling, and is the most arty-farty, joyfully autistic justification for every form of creative expression. Like, this is something that I didn't, and I have to make this as a confession, but also it's something that I'm quite proud of. In all of my years, up until about 2 years ago, I didn't get that. Like, I had this clinical really objectivist perspective, which I still think is a benefit to me. But then looking at the way that people's lives have actually been transformed, people take up flower arranging, the most ridiculous thing that you can think of. Like, that's the point. Push the boundary, do the thing that you can't imagine yourself to be, find a different version of yourself through your action. Is part of so many successful treatments. And I just think that that's joyful. That the most critically, I mean, and I use this word in the way that it is used, broken. I don't believe that people are, even some of the worst cases of PTSD, but the idea of these people broken, the way that you get to them is you get them to do something silly, like you get them to dance or draw on the floor or finger paint or experience something that they, even as adults, logically could be the most intelligent people, whatever, would never be able to get at. It's just so beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, I do kind of agree with that. Like, I'm a huge proponent of the idea that sometimes what's needed is work with the body, right?
Turn the wheel upside down.
Yeah, because sometimes it's just working through that physical activity of some sort. I mean, you gave some examples, but yeah, obviously in both our worlds, we've seen many times where undertaking some kind of physical art form, artistic movement arts, it can actually have this very powerful healing aspect to it. And you're right, it can't be rationalized. It's just something that people have to undergo and experience for themselves. So Alex, maybe you should just kind of cap off by telling us, the viewers, what time's the course, how many weeks they should expect, what the format is, and of course, drop them your email, contact details, so they know what to do.
Sure thing. Thank you. It's entirely my fault. It's starting fairly soon. It's starting on the 5th of the 1st, so just coming up. Please jump in. The way that you jump into the course is by sending me an email. I'll send these guys, they've got my email, they can put it in the description with the @ and then I just add you to the list. The fees are pay as you can, so if you don't have much money you can still come, but if you've got lots, feel free to shower me with riches. That's been the way that I've operated the entire course process. And if you hear this and it's a little bit too late, you can still jump on board because lectures are recorded. You'll just listen to a recorded version of week 1 as opposed to the rest of them. So yeah, and thank you guys for the opportunity to plug it. Unexpected and wonderful invitation to be back here.
No worries. It's a pleasure. Maybe you want to also end off if by any chance someone's watching this video, they didn't, they watch it at a much later date, they didn't have a chance to attend the course. Do you want to give some idea about what they can expect further from you and how they can stay in touch?
Yeah. So I really love running these courses. So I'll probably keep doing it for a good long while. Currently the syllabus is 3. So trauma course, Anthropology 101, and Anthropology of the Body. So embodiment and practice. I'm working on another one, so there'll probably be more. And the best way would be to check my old WordPress, Alex Pavlotski at WordPress. You'll find me pretty quickly. It's got anthropology listing there for the courses, and also just to email me and ask me questions, because then you'll know when things are running.
All right, cool. Thanks very much, Alex. Just like what Ongsu said, I really enjoy our conversation, and yeah, I'm really appreciative of how much the knowledge you share regarding, not just trauma, but also anthropology as well. So yeah, thanks so much.
Apologies to the viewers and listeners for me being in the sauna the entire time. I'll go jump in an ice bath. Apologies for the disrespect. It wasn't the plan, but it's what we went with.
Oh no worries. It's been an honor having you. Yeah.
Pleasure and best, guys. Thanks.